The Blade of Ancestors was the largest warship Jinho had ever seen. A vessel of dark metal and sharp angles that looked more like a weapon than a mode of transportation. He stood beside Velith in the shuttle bay as dozens of the Zari warriors moved around them, each one pausing to stare at the human with expressions ranging from contempt to curiosity. This gathering was a formal event, a meeting of high-ranking officers and nobles that occurred every cycle to strengthen bonds between the great Thesari House. Velith had warned Jinho that bringing him here was a risk, but she had also told him that refusing to present her ward would raise even more dangerous questions as they walked through the corridors of the massive ship. Jinho noticed how the other Thesari reacted to Velith. Some nodded with respect, recognizing her rank and reputation, but others turned away with expressions that suggested something more complicated. He asked Velith about this in a low voice, and she explained that she had never been fully accepted among her own people. She was too quiet, too thoughtful, too inclined to ask questions that made others uncomfortable. The Great Hall of the Blade of Ancestors was a vast chamber filled with Thesari in their finest armor. Their voices creating a rumble like distant thunder tables lined the edges of the room, laden with food and drink, and massive banners hung from the ceiling displaying the symbols of the great houses. Jinho felt very small and very human as he followed Velith through the crowd. The stares intensified as they moved deeper into the hall, and he heard whispers in the Thesari tongue that he could partially understand. They were talking about him, questioning why Velith had brought such a creature to this sacred gathering, and wondering what kind of weakness had driven her to choose a human as her ward. Then a voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. Loud and harsh and dripping with mockery, Commander Dreth Vaughn pushed through the gathering like a ship through calm water. His massive form, even larger than most Thesari, stood nearly 10 feet tall, his armor covered with genuine military decorations that represented decades of conquest and bloodshed. His amber eyes fixed on Jinho with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. Dreth announced loudly, enough for everyone to hear, that Velith Kos had finally shown her true nature by taking a soft little human as her ward. He declared that this was proof of what he had always suspected, that she was unfit to wear the armor of a Thesari warrior. Velith stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying an edge that Jinho had not heard before. She told Dreth that her choice of ward was her own business, and that questioning it publicly was a breach of protocol. Dreth laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the suddenly quiet hall. He said that protocol was for those who deserved respect, and that Velith had forfeited her right to respect by embracing weakness. He turned to the crowd and asked if any true Thesari could accept this insult to their traditions. The gathered warriors shifted uncomfortably, and Jinho could see that many of them agreed with Dreth, even if they were reluctant to say so openly. Velith was clearly respected, but Dreth was tapping into prejudices that ran deep in the Thesari culture. Jinho knew that if he did not act, Velith would be forced to defend herself in a way that might expose her secrets. He stepped forward and spoke in a voice that was calm and clear despite the fear churning in his stomach. He addressed Dreth directly and said that if the commander doubted the validity of their mentorship, then Jinho would gladly submit to a trial of worth to prove his fitness as Velith's ward. All went completely silent. Even Dreth seemed momentarily stunned, his amber eyes narrowing as he processed what this tiny human had just proposed. A trial of worth was an ancient Thesari tradition, a formal challenge that allowed anyone to prove their value through tests of ability. It was dangerous and often deadly, but it was also binding, and its results could not be questioned. Edrith recovered quickly and grinned with the expression of a predator who had just cornered easy prey. He accepted the challenge and declared that he would personally oversee the trial to ensure this. human received the full measure of the sorry. Justice, but Jinho was not finished. He added one more condition that sent ripples of shock through the assembled warriors. Requested that the trial be conducted under the old laws. An elderly the sorry near the front of the crowd let out a sound that was almost a gasp. This was High Keeper Morth, the oldest living the sorry, and the guardian of traditions that most had forgotten. He stepped forward and demanded to know how this human knew about the old law. Jinho bowed respectfully to the ancient warrior and explained that he had studied the sorry history extensively, and that he knew the old laws still existed even if they were rarely invoked. He argued that, since his challenge was about proving his worth in a fundamental sense, it was appropriate to use the most ancient and thorough form of trial available. Morth studied him with eyes that had seen millennia of the sorry history unfold. He asked if Jinho understood what the old laws required, and Jinho confirmed that he did under the old laws. The trial of worth consisted of 3 challenges instead of 1, and these challenges tested not just combat ability, but also mind and spirit. Dreth protested loudly, arguing that the old laws were outdated and irrelevant. But Morth silenced him with a sharp gesture. The High Keeper declared that the old laws were still valid, and that refusing to honor them would be a greater breach of tradition than anything Valeth had done. If Dreth wished to challenge the human, he would do so under the ancient rules or not at all. The crowd murmured with a mixture of excitement and unease, and Jinho saw several older the sorry nodding with what looked like approval. Dreth glared at Jinho with pure hatred, but he had no choice except to accept. To refuse now would make him look like a coward who feared the judgment of the old Losh. Declared that he accepted the terms, and that the trial would begin the next day. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with conversation about what had just occurred, Valeth pulled Jinho aside into a quiet alcove. Her expression was difficult to read, mixing what might have been admiration with obvious concern. She told him that he had just done something incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, and she was not yet sure which. Jinho admitted that he was not entirely sure either, but he explained his reasoning. The old laws existed from before the hardening, which meant they were designed for the Thesari, who valued wisdom as much as strength. He believed that gave him a fighting chance, even against someone like Drethvelith. Shook her head slowly and told him that he did not understand what he was facing. Drithvan was not just a brute who relied on size and strength. He was a decorated commander who had won dozens of trials throughout his career. Even under the old laws, the trial of body would pit Jinho against a warrior who had killed enemies far more dangerous than any human. Jinho nodded and said he had not expected this to be easy. He told Valeth that he had studied the Sari combat techniques from the historical records, including forms that modern warriors had forgotten. He did not expect to defeat Dreth in direct combat, but he believed he could survive long enough to reach the other challenges. Valeth was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. She asked him why he was doing this, why he was risking his life for her honor, when he could have simply remained silent and let her handle Dreth on her own. Jinho looked up at this towering warrior woman who wrote secret poetry and carried the weight of a buried heritage on her shoulders. He told her that some things were worth fighting for, and that the truth she carried inside her was one of those things. He said that if he could help her share that truth with others, even if only by surviving this trial, then whatever happened would be worth the risk. Valeth placed one of her massive hands on his shoulder, a gesture of connection that felt surprisingly gentle. She told him that she had not met many beings in her long life who understood what truly mattered, and that she was honored to have him as her ward. Then her expression hardened into the mask of a warrior preparing for battle. She said they had much work to do before tomorrow, and that she would teach him everything she could about Surviving what was coming, Jinho followed her out of the alcove and into the corridors of the Blade of Ancestors, knowing that the next day would determine not just his fate, but perhaps the fate of everything Valeth had been hiding. 1 month had passed since the trial aboard the Blade of Ancestors, and the galaxy had not stopped talking about what happened. News of the human who quoted forbidden Thesari philosophy had spread through communication networks like fire through a field of dry grass, reaching every corner of civilized space. Some dismissed it as exaggeration or propaganda, but others listened with growing curiosity. On Station Meridian 7, a new facility had opened in the Cultural Exchange District. The sign above the door was written in both modern and ancient Thesari script, and it read Center for Thesari Heritage. Studious Valeth Kos stood at the front of a classroom filled with students, some Thesari and some from other species, all of them eager to learn. Her title had changed, and she was no longer addressed by military rank but by a designation that had not existed for millennia. She was Cultural Reclamation Advisor, a position created specifically for her by a special decree from the High Council itself. The decree had not come easily. In the weeks following the trial, fierce debates had erupted among the Thesari leadership about what had been revealed and what it meant for their future. Traditionalists like Drethvon had argued that the old ways should remain buried, that digging up the past would weaken the Thesari society and invite contempt from other species, but they faced opposition from an unexpected source elder. The Thesari who had witnessed the trial spoke out in support of reclamation, sharing memories and fragments of knowledge they had hidden for decades. Some confessed that they too had secretly preserved pieces of their heritage, passing them down through generations in whispered words and hidden texts. The movement grew faster than anyone expected, and the High Council found itself facing a choice. They could suppress this awakening and risk fracturing their society, or they could embrace it and guide the change towards something constructive in the end. Pragmatism won over fear. Valeth had been the obvious choice to lead the reclamation effort, and she had accepted the role with a mixture of joy and terror that she confided only to Jinhano. She stood before her students and spoke about poetry, about philosophy, about the civilization that had flourished on Thessa Prime before the hardening transformed everything. Her voice was strong and clear, and her words carried the weight of truth. Finally allowed to breathe, Jinho sat near the back of the classroom. Not as a student, but as a colleague and advisor, he helped Valeth organize materials, translate ancient texts, and develop curriculum for beings who were learning to see themselves in entirely new ways. Watching her teach filled him with a satisfaction deeper than anything he had experienced before. The door opened during a discussion of old Thesari meditation practices, and the entire room went silent. Commander Drethvon stood in the doorway, his massive form blocking the light from the corridor beyond. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. Dreth had been conspicuously absent from the station since the trial, and rumors suggested he had been reassigned to distant patrol duties to keep him away from the controversy. Valeth stepped forward and asked, "What brought him here?" Her voice carefully neutral. Dreth did not answer immediately, and Jinho noticed something different about the fearsome warrior. The arrogance that had defined him seemed diminished somehow, replaced by an uncertainty that looked almost painful on such a powerful being. Finally, Dreth spoke, and his words surprised everyone in the room. He said he had come to apologize. He explained that since the trial, he had been unable to stop thinking about what he witnessed, the human's words about choice, about the possibility of strength and wisdom existing together, had haunted his thoughts during long patrols through empty space. He had begun to question things he had never questioned before, and those questions had led him to doubt everything he thought he knew about himself and his people. Dreth turned to Jinho and admitted that he had wanted to hate this small human who had humiliated him before the gathered nobles, but instead, He found himself feeling something he had never expected to feel. He felt grateful the philosophy Jinho had quoted spoke of blades that cut the hands that wield them. And Dreth confessed that he had spent his entire life being exactly that kind of blade. He had won victories and earned glory, but somewhere along the way, he had lost pieces of himself that he could not even name. He asked, almost hesitantly, if he might be allowed to learn what this class was teaching. He wanted to understand what his ancestors had known, what wisdom they had preserved before the hardening took it away. The room remained absolutely silent as everyone waited for Velith's response. She studied Dreth for a long moment, and Jinho could see emotions flickering across her features as she processed this unexpected development. Then she stepped aside and gestured toward an empty seat near the front of the classroom. She told him that all were welcome who came seeking knowledge with honest hearts, and that his presence honored their work. Dreth moved to the seat with a humility that seemed alien on his massive frame. And when he sat down, something shifted in the energy of the room. If Commander Drethvan could embrace the old ways, then perhaps there was hope for all the Sari who struggled with the same questions. The class continued, and Jinho watched as Velith adapted her teaching to include this unexpected student. She was patient and generous with Dreth, answering his questions without mockery and helping him understand concepts that seemed to genuinely confuse him. Later that evening, Jinho and Velith stood together on an observation deck overlooking the stars. The station rotated slowly, and distant galaxies wheeled past the transparent walls like dancers at an endless ball. Velith asked him the question she had been wanting to ask since the trial. She wanted to know why he had really chosen her that day in the selection hall. What had driven a young human scholar to stake his future on a 9-foot warrior who wrote secret poetry? Jinho considered the question carefully before answering. Told her that when he first learned about the Visari, he felt an immediate connection that he struggled to explain. Here was a species that had been forced to become something other than what they truly were, that had buried their authentic nature to survive in a hostile universe. That story resonated with him because humanity had faced similar struggles throughout their history. Humans had often been forced to choose between survival and principle, between power and wisdom, between who they were and who they needed to be. And too often, humanity had chosen poorly. But the beautiful thing about beings who could think and feel and choose was that no decision had to be permanent. Every moment offered another opportunity to remember what truly mattered, to reach back through time and reclaim the values that had been sacrificed. He had chosen Velith because he saw in her armor-covered heart the same struggle that defined humanity at its best. She was a warrior who wrote poetry, a soldier who remembered wisdom, a product of the hardening who had never fully hardened. He believed that if he could help her share what she had preserved, the ripples would spread outward and change things in ways neither of them could predict. Velith was quiet for a long time after he finished speaking. When she finally responded, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. She told him that humans were strange creatures, small and fragile and so terribly brief in their existence, but perhaps that brevity gave them a perspective that longer-lived species had lost, an urgency about what mattered and a willingness to risk everything for ideas that might not bear fruit for generations. She asked him what humans called someone who could see through walls and find the truth hidden behind them. Jinho smiled and gave her the simplest answer he could think of. He said that humans called such a person a friend. Velith made a sound that might have been a laugh. Though her species was not known for laughter, she told him that friendship was a concept the warrior the Sari had abandoned as useless sentiment. But perhaps it was time to reclaim that too. Below them, the station continued its slow rotation, and somewhere in the depths of space, the Sari were reading forbidden poetry for the first time and asking questions their parents had been afraid to ask. The galaxy was changing. not through conquest or force, but through the quiet spread of truths that could no longer be contained. And it had started because one human nerd did his homework, picked the tallest alien woman in the room, and showed her that her secret was exactly what the galaxy needed to see. Jinho looked out at the stars that humans had spent millennia dreaming about, and he felt profoundly grateful to be alive in this moment. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, it was also full of hope. That was enough. That was everything. The ancient trial grounds occupied a section of the Blade of Ancestors that had not been used in over 1,000 years. Dust motes floated in the air as the massive doors swung open, and Jinho walked into a circular chamber surrounded by tiered seating that rose toward the distant ceiling. Hundreds of the Sari had gathered to witness this unprecedented event, and their amber eyes tracked him like predators watching prey enter their territory. High Keeper Morath stood at the center of the chamber, his ancient form somehow commanding despite his age. Beside him, Dreth Van waited with barely contained eagerness, his armor polished to a mirror shine, and his hands flexing in anticipation. Valith took her place among the observers, and Jinho could feel her gaze on him like a physical touch. Morath raised his hand for silence, and the crowd immediately obeyed. He announced that today they would witness something that had not occurred in millennia. A trial of worth conducted under the old laws explained the rules for those who had never heard them, describing the 3 challenges that would determine whether this human was worthy to stand beside a Thessera. The trial of body would come. First, Morath declared that the challenger must survive against his opponent for the span of 300 heartbeats. He emphasized that the goal was not victory, but endurance, and that the trial would end when the time elapsed, or when the challenger could no longer continue. Drith stepped forward and drew a practice blade from a rack near the wall. A weapon designed to bruise and break, but not to kill. Jinho was offered a similar weapon, and he took it with hands that trembled only slightly. He had spent the entire night with Valith, learning movements and techniques that she had recovered from ancient texts. They were forms that modern Thessari had abandoned as impractical, styles designed for smaller bodies and quicker minds. The trial began when Morath dropped his raised hand, moved with terrifying speed, his massive form closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Jinho did not try to block or parry, knowing that any direct confrontation with that much force would shatter his guard. Instead, he moved. He twisted sideways as the blade whistled past his head, using a footwork pattern that Valith had shown him from records of the old defensive schools. Dreth's second strike came almost instantly, but Jinho was already somewhere else, sliding beneath the arc of the weapon and rolling to his feet 3 paces away. The crowd murmured with surprise, and Jinho saw confusion flash across Dreth's face. The commander had expected to end this quickly, to prove that humans were too weak and slow to deserve any place in the Sari tradition. But Jinho was not fighting like a human. He was fighting like a scholar from Thesser Prime, using techniques developed by beings who knew they would never match their enemies in raw power. Dreth pressed his attack with growing frustration, each strike faster and harder than the last. Jinho felt the wind of those blows passing close enough to ruffle his hair, and twice the blade caught his shoulder or arm with glancing impacts that would leave ugly bruises. But he kept moving, kept sliding and twisting and refusing to be where Dreth expected him to be. Heartbeats counted down, and Jinho lost track of everything except the next movement, the next breath, the next moment of survival. His muscles burned with exhaustion, and his lungs screamed for air. But he refused to stop. When Morath finally called the end of the trial, Jinho collapsed to his knees. Gasping for breath, Dreth stood over him with an expression that mixed fury with something that might have been grudging respect. Morath announced that the human had survived, and that the trial of body was complete. The crowd erupted in murmurs of astonishment, and Jinho saw several elder Thessari nodding with what looked like recognition. They had seen something in his movements. Echoes of styles they had only read about in forbidden texts. The trial of mind came next. Morris led them to a section of the chamber where a complex arrangement of stones and symbols had been set into the floor. He explained that this was a strategic puzzle based on ancient Dasari philosophy, a test that required participants to demonstrate not just intelligence but wisdom. The puzzle involved moving pieces across a grid to achieve a specific configuration. But the rules were complex and the solutions were not obvious. Drith went first, and Jinho watched carefully as the massive warrior studied the board with furrowed brows. The commander was not stupid, and he quickly grasped the basic mechanics of the puzzle. He began moving pieces with aggressive efficiency, seeking the most direct path to victory. But the puzzle fought back. Each obvious solution led to complications. Each aggressive move created new problems, and Dreth's frustration grew as his approach repeatedly failed. After many attempts, he finally achieved a configuration that Marath declared acceptable. Though the High Keeper's tone suggested it was barely so, Jinho stepped forward and studied the reset puzzle with different eyes. He recognized the underlying philosophy from his years of research. The way the puzzle was designed to punish domination and reward cooperation. Each piece was not an opponent to be conquered, but a partner to be understood. He began moving pieces slowly, not forcing them into position, but guiding them into relationships where they supported each other. Where Dreth had seen obstacles, Jinho saw opportunities for harmony. The solution came together like music finding its resolution. And when he placed the final piece, the entire configuration seemed to glow with brightness. Morath was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried an emotion that Jinho could not quite identify. He declared that the human had not merely solved the puzzle, but had demonstrated mastery of principles that the Vizari themselves had forgotten. The crowd was no longer just murmuring, but actively discussing what they were witnessing. Jinho saw Elder Vizari with tears in their eyes, and he understood that he had touched something deep within their collective memory. The final challenge was the trial of spirit. Morath explained that each participant must speak a truth that cost them something, a revelation that demonstrated courage beyond physical bravery. Dreth went first again, and he spoke of his conquests with obvious pride. He told of enemies defeated, worlds brought to heel, and the glory he had won through strength and ruthlessness. His truth was that he had never known fear, that he had never doubted his purpose, and that he would die before accepting weakness in himself or others. The crowd nodded with approval, recognizing the warrior ideal that Dreth embodied. Then Jinho stepped forward to speak his truth. He began by talking about humanity, about the short and violent history of his species. He told the Vizari that humans had committed terrible crimes against each other, that they had built empires on suffering and destruction, and that even now they struggled with the darkness within themselves. But then he spoke of choice. He said that humans had faced moments when they could have become monsters forever, when the easy path would have led them to abandon everything good and true in pursuit of survival. And at those moments, again and again, enough humans had chosen differently. They had chosen to reach for something better, to believe that strength and compassion could exist together, and to build futures worth living in. Jinho looked directly at the warrior at the bar, gathered the Sari and spoke his final truth. He said that he had come here because he believed that the Sari faced the same choice that humanity had faced so many times before. He believed that somewhere beneath the armor and the weapons and the traditions of conquest, there were still beings who remembered what wisdom meant, who still carried the poetry of their ancestors in their hearts. Even if they dared not speak it aloud, he recited a line in Old Dasari, words he had memorized from Vilith's secret collection, and the effect was like lightning striking the chamber. The words meant that strength without wisdom is a blade that cuts the hand that wields it, and they came from a philosophical text that had been forbidden for millennia elder Dasari, throughout the crowd rose to their feet, their expressions showing shock and recognition, and something that looked like hope. Highkeeper Morath stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, his ancient eyes fixed on this small human who had just quoted sacred words that most believed were lost forever. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He declared that Jinho had passed the trial of worth, but more than that, he had reminded the Dasari of something they had forgotten. He had shown them that their past was not a weakness to be buried, but a power. Foundation to be honored. Rith stood rigid with barely contained rage. But he could say nothing. The old laws were clear, and Morath's judgment could not be questioned. Jinho looked across the chamber and found Vila's eyes. She was not crying exactly, but her expression held more emotion than he had ever seen from her. In that moment, he knew that everything he had risked was worth it. The trial was over, but something much larger had just begun. The selection hall of Station Meridian 7 stretched out like a cathedral made of glass and starlight, and Park Jinho stood among 300 other humans who had come to choose their fate. Every human who entered galactic society had to select a mentor species, and this ceremony would determine the next year of their lives. Jinho watched the other humans around him, their eyes scanning the dozens of alien delegations that lined the massive hall like exhibits in a museum of the impossible. The Mallory delegation drew the biggest crowd, and Jinho understood why these small creatures stood barely 4 feet tall, with soft blue fur and enormous eyes that sparkled with warmth and welcome. They were traders and diplomats, famous throughout the galaxy for their kindness and patience with newcomers. Young woman beside Jinho whispered to her friend that she would definitely pick a Mallory because they seemed so nice and safe. The Brunei attracted the second largest group of interested humans, and their tall, willowy forms swayed gently as they spoke in musical voices about their universities and research centers. They were academics and teachers, and many humans saw them as the obvious choice for learning about galactic civilization, but Jinho was not looking at the Mallory or the Brenahias. Attention fixed on the far corner of the hall where 5 towering figures stood in complete isolation. The Desarino human had approached them, and the empty space around their delegation spoke louder than any warning. These beings stood between 8 and 9 feet tall, their skin the color of dark iron, their faces sharp and angular like weapons given flesh. Their eyes glowed with a faint amber light, and even from across the hall, Jinho could feel the weight of their presence. Everyone in the galaxy knew the Desaridi were warriors without equal, conquerors who had carved their name into the history of 1,000 worlds. Their warships patrolled the borders of civilized space, and their soldiers were the stuff of nightmares. A man near Jinho muttered that only a fool would choose those monsters, and several others nodded in agreement. Jinho took a deep breath and began walking. He moved past the Mallory delegation where humans were already shaking hands and exchanging warm greetings. He walked past the Brene who offered him gentle smiles and gestures of welcome. He ignored the Vrix with their chitinous shells and the Dure with their flowing robes and the dozen other species who watched this small human with curiosity. The crowd began to notice his path, and whispers spread like fire through dry grass. Someone called out and asked where he was going, and another voice said he must be lost or confused. But Jinho kept walking until he stood before the Dasari delegation up close. They were even more imposing than he had imagined. The smallest of them towered over him by at least 3 feet, and their presence made the air feel heavy and thick. But Jinho was not looking at the smallest. His eyes found the tallest among them, a female who stood 9 feet and 3 inches by his estimation. Her armor was darker than the others, etched with patterns that most observers would assume were military decorations. But Jinho knew better. He had spent 6 years studying every fragment of the Sari culture he could find, piecing together texts and artifacts that most scholars had dismissed as incomplete or irrelevant. Knew those patterns on her armor were not military symbols. They were poetry. Her name was Velith Kos, and she was a high-ranking officer in the Dasari fleet. But that was not why Jinho had chosen her. The other Dasari regarded him with expressions that mixed contempt and confusion. But Velith simply stared down at him with eyes that revealed nothing. Jinho placed his right hand over his heart, then extended it outward with his palm facing up, and finally bowed his head while keeping his eyes on hers. Reaction was immediate, and electric. Every Dasari in the delegation went rigid, their amber eyes widening with shock. Velith herself took a half-step backward as if Jinho had struck her. The gesture he had just performed was ancient. So ancient that it predated the Dasari's transformation into the warrior race they had become. It was a greeting used by scholars to honor fellow seekers of truth, and it had not been used in over 3,000 years. Jinho held the position, waiting. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, and he could feel the eyes of everyone in the hall burning into his back. Finally, Velith spoke, and her voice was deep and resonant like distant thunder. She asked him where he had learned that gesture, and her words carried a tremor that seemed impossible for such a powerful being. Jinho straightened and answered that he had learned it from the writings of Thesser Prime, from the fragments of the Third Philosophical Academy that had been preserved in the archives of the Dure. Told her that he knew what her people had been before the hardening era, and he knew what they had sacrificed to serve. Velith stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her amber eyes. It was not warmth exactly, but it was not the cold disdain she had shown before. She turned to the other Dasari and spoke in their harsh native tongue, and whatever she said made them exchange glances of profound unease. Then she looked back at Jinho and spoke the formal words of acceptance. She declared that she would take this human as her ward, that she would guide him through his first year in galactic society, and that his successes and failures would reflect upon her honor. The words were traditional and expected, but her voice carried an undertone that made the other Dasari shift uncomfortably. Jinho bowed again, this time in the modern style that all species recognized, and thanked her for the honor she had granted him. As he rose, he caught a glimpse of the crowd behind him. Humans and aliens alike watched with expressions of disbelief and concern, and he heard someone say that the poor fool had just signed his death warrant. But Jinho was not afraid. He had chosen Velith Kos for a reason, and that reason had nothing to do with death. The selection ceremony continued around them as other humans made safer and more sensible choices. But Jinho no longer paid attention to the proceedings. He stood beside his new mentor, this towering warrior woman whose armor was secretly covered in poetry, and he waited for the ceremony to end. Velith did not speak to him again during the event, but he noticed that her posture had changed. Where before she had stood with the rigid formality of a soldier on display, she now carried herself with something that looked almost like curiosity. When the ceremony finally concluded, the Dasari delegation began to leave, and Velith gestured for Jinho to follow as they walked toward the exit. The tallest of the male Dasari leaned close to Velith and asked her why she had accepted this human. He pointed out that the greeting the human had used was forbidden knowledge, and that accepting him could bring unwanted attention from the High Council. Velith replied without looking at her colleague, saying that was exactly why she had accepted him. Then she glanced down at Jinho with those amber eyes that still revealed so little, and she said something that made his heart beat faster. She told him that he had started something today that could not be stopped, and she hoped he understood the weight of what he had done. Jinho nodded and said that he understood perfectly. He had not chosen the tallest Dasari because he wanted protection or prestige. He had chosen her because he knew her secret, and he believed that secret could change everything. Velith's quarters aboard Station Meridian 7 were nothing like what Jinho had expected. He had imagined walls covered with weapons, trophies from conquered enemies, and the cold efficiency of a military barracks instead. He found a space that was sparse but not harsh, with soft lighting and shelves lined with objects that seemed more like artifacts than decorations. She gestured for him to sit on a low bench near the center of the room, and she remained standing, her massive form casting a shadow that covered half the floor for several minutes. Neither of them spoke. Velith paced slowly, her movements surprisingly graceful for someone of her size. And Jinho could see that she was wrestling with something inside herself finally. She stopped and turned to face him with an intensity that made him want to look away. She demanded to know how he had truly learned the old greeting. And her voice was harder now than it had been in the selection hall. She told him that the gesture he had performed was erased from the Sari records over 2,000 years ago, and that anyone caught using it faced severe punishment. Jinho met her gaze and explained his story from the beginning. He told her about his childhood on Earth, about the moment humanity first made contact with galactic civilization, and about how that event had changed the course of his life. Had been 22 years old when the Brene ship appeared above Seoul, and while most people around him felt fear or wonder, Jinho felt something different. He felt certainty. He knew in that moment that he would dedicate his life to understanding the beings who lived among the stars. And that passion had led him down paths that most humans never considered. He spent 6 years in the archives of every species that would grant him access, searching for information about the oldest civilizations in the galaxy. The Thesari fascinated him from the start, because their history contained a gap that no one seemed willing to discuss. Every other species had records stretching back tens of thousands of years, showing gradual changes and developments. The Thesari records began abruptly 4,000 years ago, and everything before that point was either missing or classified as forbidden. Jinho told Velith that he had found fragments scattered across a dozen worlds, pieces of a puzzle that the Thesari themselves had tried to destroy. He found poetry carved into the ruins of an outpost that the Dure had preserved as a historical curiosity. He found philosophical texts in the personal collection of a Mallory merchant who had no idea what he possessed. He found references to something called the Third Philosophical Academy in a damaged data core that had been recovered from a ship that crashed 10,000 years ago. Piece by piece, Jinho had assembled a picture of what the Thesari had been before they became warriors. They were scholars and artists, philosophers and poets, beings who valued wisdom above all else, and who believed that understanding was more powerful than force. Their homeworld had been called Desert Prime, and it had been a center of learning that drew students from across the galaxy. Then something terrible happened. Jinho paused in his explanation, and he saw that Velith had gone very still. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and her amber eyes had grown bright with an emotion he could not name. He continued more gently, saying that he had found references to an invasion, a sudden and brutal attack by a species called the Vreth. Vreth had no interest in knowledge or culture, and they destroyed Desert Prime with weapons that turned the entire planet into ash. The Thesari who survived were scattered across the galaxy, refugees without a home, and they faced a choice that would define them forever. They could remain who they were and risk extinction, or they could become something new and serve. Velith spoke for the first time since his explanation began, and her voice was barely above a whisper. She said that her people called it the hardening, and that it was the only truth young Thesari were taught. She explained that every child of her species learned from birth that they were warriors, that softness was death, and that the old ways had been a weakness that nearly destroyed them. But she had always felt something was wrong with that story. She walked to one of the shelves and picked up a small object that looked like a crystal tablet. She held it carefully, almost reverently, and told Jinho that she had found this in the ruins of an old Dasari outpost when she was barely an adulthood. Contained poetry written in a language that no modern Dasari was supposed to understand. And reading it had changed something inside her. She had spent the next 30 years secretly learning the old language, secretly writing her own poetry, and secretly hating herself for what she saw as a shameful weakness no other Dasari could know. She explained, because the penalty for practicing the old ways was exile or worse. The High Council had declared millennia ago that the past must remain buried, and anyone who dug it up was a traitor to everything that the Dasari had become. Jinho stood and walked toward her. Stopping at a respectful distance, he told her that he did not think she was weak, and that he did not think her ancestors were wrong to value wisdom. He said that humanity had faced similar choices throughout their history, moments when they could have become monsters to survive, and that the struggle between who they were and who they needed to be was something every thinking species understood. He asked if he could read her. Poet Trevelith looked at him with an expression that mixed fear and hope and something that might have been loneliness. She handed him the crystal tablet and showed him how to activate it. Words appeared in the air above the device, flowing script in a language Jinho had spent years learning to read. He read slowly, savoring each line, and when he finished, he looked up at Velith with genuine admiration. He told her that the poem was beautiful, that it used a lament structure he recognized from the writings of the Third Academy, and that her ancestors would be proud of what she had created. Velith turned away, and Jinho realized with shock that she was trying to hide tears when she spoke again. Her voice was thick with emotion that she clearly was not used to expressing. She told him that no one had ever read her work before, that she had lived for over 200 years believing she was the only Dasari who remembered what they had been, and that hearing someone understand her words was more painful and wonderful than she could describe it. Jinho gave her time to compose herself, and when she turned back to face him, her expression had hardened into something more familiar. She told him that what he knew was dangerous, and that there were the Dasari who would kill them both to keep the old ways hidden. She explained that the High Council had spent millennia building the myth of the Dasari invincibility, and that myth depended on everyone believing the warriors had always been warriors. If the truth came out, if other species learned that the mighty Dasari had once been gentle scholars, it could undermine everything her people had built. Jinho nodded and said he understood the risk, but he also told her that secrets like this could not stay buried forever, and that maybe the time had come for the Dasari to remember who they truly were. Velith studied him with those amber eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to something deeper. She asked why he cared so much about her people, and why a human would risk his life for a truth that was not his to tell. Jinho smiled and gave her an answer that she clearly did not expect. He told her that he had chosen her because he recognized something in the Dasari that he saw in his own species. Humans had also been forced to become harder than they wanted to be, had also buried parts of themselves to survive, and had also struggled with the question of whether strength and wisdom could exist together. He believed the answer was yes, and he believed that the Dasari could help humanity prove it. Velith was silent for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of a decision that could not be undone. She told him that she would teach him everything she knew about the old ways, but she warned him that this path would lead them into conflict with powers that even she feared. Jinho bowed his head and accepted her terms. Had not come all this way to turn back now.